When Adityanath's government promulgated the Uttar Pradesh Prohibition of Unlawful Conversion of Religion Ordinance 2020, it elicited a mixed reaction. This was predictable given the highly polarized state of our country. The right wingers celebrated it as a triumph against love jihad. The reaction emboldened other BJP ruled states to come up with similar laws. While our liberal political parties remained largely muted in their protests, there was great distress in the non-political liberal circles. Actually, we can safely assume that there is no political party in India that can be described as liberal or secular in the real sense of these two terms. The Congress is wedded to soft Hindutva now, unlike its earlier loyalty to secularism. And most other parties are either caste-based or community-based, or they are run by families as their private concerns. As far as the leftist parties are concerned, they have stopped being of any consequence in our national politics. Frankly, these communists cannot be described as liberal by any stretch of imagination because they are highly regimented and they are totalitarian in their by nature. They just can't shed that. They cannot be democratic. Let us assume they come to power and absolute majority. First thing they would do is shed the constitution and bring in the so-called rule of the proletariat. Nevertheless, there are political commentators who feel that the provisions of this ordinance appear even-handed, but there is no way to ensure their even-handed implementation in real-life situations, given the manner in which various other laws have been used to muffle dissent or intimidate Muslims or other political opponents. When a mere journalist or civil rights activist can be easily painted as an anti-national or a terrorist and thrown behind bars, what chance do the hapless lovers from ordinary families stand against the state machinery? We all know once an ordinary person is behind bars, there is nobody to stand up for him or her. Every step that Modi, Shah and company have taken so far has targeted the minority, especially Muslims. So it is no wonder this ordinance has been dubbed as anti-interfaith marriages, although it is touted as a preemptive move against love jihad, which is actually a convenient bogey for creating vote banks. It is nothing more, nothing less. It is a menace to the minorities, Muslims especially, but the fact that provisions of this ordinance can be interpreted in a manner that will label even genuine love marriages as criminal is bound to curtail an individual's ability to exercise her choice in matters which are strictly private and personal. But the rulers are unfazed by the fact that they are permanently enabling the state to directly interfere in the private decision making of the citizens, which they are not supposed to do. They behave as if they have gained permanent tenancy on the seat of power. Little have they learned from history. And what does history tell us? That those who look invincible today can be humbled by the will of the people or by the processes of history. You just look at so-called powerful dynasties and other political parties. Look at the fate of Indian National Congress. Or if you want to go a bit further, look at the fate of the Mughals, who at one time looked invincible. Or Mauryas, before that. Everywhere, the history does not allow anybody to have permanent power. Anyways, over the millennia, love had to cope with a vast range of reactions fueled by hate, jealousy, prejudice, hubris, and insecurities. And these insecurities could be personal, social, political, anything. Let us not forget that love legends like Sasi Punnu, Heer Ranjha, Laila Majnu, and Mirza Sahiba were driven by passion and destroyed by societal wrath. However, while class differences and tribal animosities played major roles, religion and creed were absent in those times. It was never a interfaith marriages, or that did not really matter as much as the personal egos of the two clans or other tribal rivalries or animosities. More recent Indian literature has dwelt upon interfaith alliances located in a variety of social, political, and geographical backgrounds. For example, Bankim Chatterjee's Durgesh Nandini, which was published in 1865, shows Ayesha, a Pathan princess of Orissa, falling in love with Jagat Singh, the son of her father's enemy. In Jyotindranath Tagore's play Asrumati, the princess of Chittor is abducted by Mughal forces, and later on Akbar's son Salim falls in love with her. She reciprocates his love, and that forms the crux of this novel. Similarly, Rabindranath Tagore's Musalmani Galpa in 1940 is a complex tale of interfaith marriage, conversion, and prejudice. Similarly, Pratibha Basu's Samudra Hrudaya, published in 1959, features Nawab of Dhaka in love with a Hindu lawyer's daughter named Kamla. In the real world, love has had a wide range of enemies. Social restrictions based on caste, gotra, class, and creed are behind the continuing spate of honor killings across India. This phenomenon is so complex that it has become beyond one's comprehension. The web of stratifications based on castes and subcastes, outer and inner red lines for marriage alliances in each caste would boggle the minds of the uninitiated, and this is a fact. So fanatically are these red lines guarded that one would cross them at the risk of one's life, limb, and of course, honor. There are strict social taboos in rural India that forbid marriages between couples residing in the same village or in some cases nearby villages. In many urban and semi-urban areas, a new trend of moral policing began in tandem with violent campaigns against Valentine's Day celebrators. Police campaigns against couples in public places in UP and other North Indian states, and beating up of girls visiting pubs in Karnataka, Maharashtra, and other states in the name of Bharatiya Sanskriti have not been forgotten. Perhaps this moral policing was a rehearsal for something far more sinister. Earlier, the state used to appear either neutral or on the side of the victims of such violence. Now the state has come openly against interfaith relationships, be these marriages or romantic affairs. The right-wing campaigners had coined the term love jihad as a wistful slogan against interfaith marriages long back. But now it has become the driving force behind enactment of draconian laws that clearly reduce law-abiding citizens to the status of helpless victims of hostile laws they had never voted for. Interfaith relationships provoke the most virulent opposition and mob violence throughout the country now. Most significant being the 1952 marriage of Sikandar Bakht, a Muslim belonging to the butcher caste called Qureshi. He was married to Raj Sharma, a Hindu girl. There were riots. Bhatt was damned by the Hindu Mahasabha, and the RSS mouthpiece organizer described him as notorious Sikandar Bhatt, a commander of the Muslim League's National Guards. But look at the hypocrisy. But the same Bhatt later became the BJP's Muslim face and remained so until his death. Today that role is being played by the likes of Mukhtar Abbas Naqvi and Shahnawaz Hussain, who have Hindu wives. Not that BJP's Hindu male leaders don't have non-Hindu wives. Dinesh Gundu Rao readily comes to one's mind. His wife is a Muslim. Yet politics has been the vilest enemy of love and lovers in India. Unlike prejudice-driven hate towards love, politics is cold, calculating and exploitative. It manipulates prevalent fears, insecurities and prejudices to serve the ends of power-hungry politicians. This phenomenon is pushing India away from the enlightened path of modernity into the darkness of bigotry and medievalism. The most illustrative incident is the furor against Tanishq advertisement, which should have been appreciated as a fine instance of India's secular plural ethos. But should we be surprised? Because for ages, marriages have had several strands that make them anything but personal in nature in India. Wealth, power, status, etc. have been major deciding factors, while love was always, even today, it has been peripheral. In medieval India, the purpose behind interfaith marriages among royal families was invariably strategic and not romantic, no matter what later on those writers present them as. There was nothing romantic about any of those so-called interfaith marriages. Today we find similar trends among our elites. By acts of omission and commission, the powers that be have been abridging the citizens' fundamental rights in India nowadays. With a frightening deliberateness, the present regime has been curtailing some of the most important fundamental rights granted under our constitution. For example, Article 14 provides for equality and equal protection of all. Article 15 provides for prohibition of discrimination. Article 16 provides for equality of opportunity. Article 21 provides for protection of life and personal liberty. And Article 25 provides for freedom of conscience. In 2017, a 9-judge bench had upheld the citizens' fundamental right to privacy. It was emphatic while stating that individuals have the right to exercise personal choices, including the right to choose one's life partner, irrespective of the religion they practiced. In 2018, the court restated its position in the Hadia case. It is time for India's constitutional institutions to firmly reverse this degenerating trend. Regressive forces are on the ascendant and are bent upon imposing theocracy on the secular India. Our judiciary and parliament need to wake up and put down these forces before it is too late. Thanks for being with me. I'll come up with another episode soon. Bye.